All right, so if you're sitting in this room, you are here to learn about custom trigger policies. Is anyone currently using custom triggers on your policies right now? Awesome, quite a few. Are any of you using them as part of an automation? Great. So you could all come up here and do this with me? All right, so let's talk a little bit about custom trigger policies. Again, my name is Joey Jenkins. I usually use Joseph for professional reasons because why not? And my colleague here, Lisa Davies. So, intro to custom trigger policies. Well, what are they? Well, custom trigger policies are the same as any other policies. They can be executed only when you call that custom trigger. What can they do? They do the same thing as any other policy. They just do it when you call a specific custom trigger. And that custom trigger can be anything from Bob or Disney World. How can they be used? In multiple different ways. We're here specifically to talk about how they can be used as part of automated deployments for operating systems, for software installs, software updates, and varied other uses. So why use them? Well, at my environment, in CSU libraries, we have several different types of software, we call them stacks, that have to be applied in a specific way, at a specific time, and for specific reasons. So whether or not you have to do the same thing in your own environment, hopefully this will be of some use to you. So just to review the different types of policy execution events, you can use them at startup, log in, log out, network state change, so you change your IP address, something changes with your wireless, what have you. Enrollment complete, probably the most familiar to all of you is I want my device to be configured at enrollment. Recurring check-in, whenever your recurring check-in for your device is, it executes a policy. And then ours that we're going to talk about today is the custom trigger. So when you configure a policy, the first thing that you might notice is you have all of those options available to you, and here is the checkbox of custom, and again, you can just set the custom event to be whatever you want. Again, Bob, Disney World, what have you. And you can have multiple policies fire off per event based on a custom trigger. So a use case. Well, we're going to have Lisa come up and talk about how we can first get the operating system on through a custom trigger. Lisa?
So the best way to go through a custom trigger is with an example. We know that this example might have been used yesterday, so perhaps take a look at this example, look at yesterday's, piece it together for something that's going to work well for you. So we're going to take a slight software engineering or project approach to this, and we're going to start with our use cases. Our first use case is a user that might have done something to their Mac, and they want to replace down the OS and be confident that it's in a good state. Maybe these are your developers in your environment. Another use case is our technicians that are at the front line and reprovisioning devices. Let's give them a couple of less clicks to do and make their jobs just a little bit easier. So we have our requirements here for how we're going to do this for our sprint. The first one is that we're going to use self-service to make this erase install available. Then the user or a technician will be able to use that policy to have the OS placed back down, the disk erased, and then once that's completed, we'll be able to measure our success because device enrollment kicks back in and resets up that device for the user. We can break down this process into a few basic steps, and then these will become the steps that we use to write a very short script. The first step is we're going to check for an existing installer. How many times have we seen a partial download from the App Store? We want to make sure that's not still on the device, which might not have this end particularly well. Once we've checked that and done any cleanup necessary, we'll cache down the installer for High Sierra in this particular example. Then we need to validate that that cache that we've placed down in the waiting room, is it all there? Did the device go offline partway through? Because we don't want to attempt to install a partial cache file. That's not just going to end very well for any of us. The next piece, once we've done that, is we can begin the actual install. I'm a person that likes to draw a lot of scribbles. then I'll figure out if I've got a problem with my workflow or if I'm doing something in an illogical order. So this is what this workflow or algorithm could possibly look like. And we've got the 4 steps here. We're going to check for the app, deal with that if it's there, cache the installer, validate that cache, and then we'll begin our install. So to make this successful, we need to have 4 things. We have a smart group for our scoping. You can scope that as you like. So of course you want to make sure there's enough disk space to be able to do this. You want to make sure the hardware supports it, and any other restrictions that might be specific for your organization. Then we're going to have 3 policies. The first policy contains a script which runs all of the logic, and the last 2 policies will be our custom trigger example. We've just talked about our criteria for the smart group. The really important one I want to call out there is making sure that there's enough disk space to be able to pull down the installer and be able to run that. If there's not, the disk is too full, you'll need to show some sort of error message or exclude those computers from this policy altogether. Our first policy payload has a script. That script runs the logic, calls our custom triggers. Our second policy, it's going to install the cache. So we're going to use the custom trigger of cache HS. It's got 2 pieces in its payload. First step, cache the package. Second step, verify the health of that cache. If we make it past there, the first policy with that script is going to call our final policy, which is going to have the custom trigger of install HS and do the actual work of the erase install. We have a short amount of code here. Don't worry, you'll get it later, and there's really not much to it. So in this code, I don't know if I'm standing in everybody's way, the first thing we're going to do is see whether or not that High Sierra installer is already there. If it's there, we're going to remove it. The second part, we're going to call the custom trigger, cache HS, which will place down in the Jamf waiting room a copy of install macOS. Now this policy also contains an after script, which we'll look at in a moment to validate that cache. That after script, if the cache does not validate, removes the file so that it's not there. Let's say theoretically something went wrong and it removes it. We can use the Jamf helper to display a short message that something went wrong, maybe try again. Perhaps you need to plug into Ethernet or move closer to an access point. If we make it this far, then we're calling the final policy with the custom trigger of install High Sierra. So that's our script. Nice and short. I think there's more lines of comment than there are of code in this particular script. So when we're caching the package, we can have an after priority script to validate the checksum. This particular script is taking 2 arguments. The first argument is the path of the cache in the waiting room, and the second is the hash that we're expecting to see. So we have this script here that's going to do that checksum validation of the cache, and if the cache hash doesn't match out, we're going to remove it. So this makes us able to use reusable code. You can have this in your Jamf as a validate the checksum of a cached file, and you can reuse it in policy after policy by changing the 2 arguments that you saw on the previous slide. And here's another example where those arguments are populated. We have the waiting room path, and then we have the hash that we're expecting to see. Our third policy does the actual work. We're going to install that cached package, and then we're going to run the command that will kick off the erase install. I hope that you find this useful for your environment. I'm going to pass back to Joey now, and he's got some really good demonstrations of what they're doing at North Carolina libraries. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, so now that we've got an operating system on our machine, well, we want to get some software on there. Now, you might be familiar with using the enrollment complete trigger. We use the same thing. We install all of our software via enrollment, but we have that custom trigger policies that are set up because we have to install those at a certain way, certain time, so on and so forth. Now, you can use custom triggers in multiple different ways. You can install at enrollment, as I'm going to walk through here in a bit. You can call a custom trigger policy from a terminal. You can install a custom trigger policy as part of a script, or you can really get into the deep dive and start calling custom trigger policies from another policy itself. So our enrollment policy with custom triggers is we have one enrollment policy for our entire environment for every single device, Mac OS device that we use, and I like to refer to that as the one enrollment policy to rule them all. Any Tolkien fans out there? Sweet. We have one example at the top here of the script that we use, and we have two different types of setup that we call. We want to install it as a laptop setup, or we want to install it as a desktop setup. And we do that because we have different network requirements for our laptops and desktops. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to figure out what type of device this is. And if you'll look, I've got a variable defined called HW model for hardware model, and it returns the hardware model of the device that's enrolled. If that hardware model contains the name MacBook, then it's going to fire off my laptop setup. Otherwise, it's going to fire the desktop setup. And underneath is the initial configuration policy. This script sets several different things, but one of the most important things that I have set up here is setting the machine name. Now, the machine name is another variable where I call the host name of the device with that -s trigger, which returns the short name of the device. So in a case where the machine name would be registered as libstaff-1234.lib.ncsu.edu, the -s trigger allows me to return libstaff-12345. That way I don't have that .lib go on. And you'll see why that's important here in just a second. As I said, our software installs in specific orders because of specific requirements that we have. One of the things that I use for that is, again, that HName variable that returns the short name of the host name of the device. And I'm going to continue on with the libstaff example. If the HName equals libstaff dash, then call the custom trigger policy of Jamf policy -trigger staff config. So that way we have our computer names will determine the type of configuration that each device gets. Now that staff config trigger is called from another script, and that staff config policy executes this script that you see right here. You'll notice that I have an install policy and a verify policy. That install policy does what you might suspect. It installs the software and needs configurations for that software, but I also found that occasionally I need a sanity check for if something has been installed. So I have a verify policy. Now that verify policy checks to see if the software has been installed, and if it hasn't, then execute the install policy again. And if it fails too many times, it writes an error to the logs and lets me know if I have to figure out what's going on with the install policy. Do I have a bad package? Do I have bad configurations, licensing? Who knows? So here's how that verification works. Now, these scripts are all going to be available afterwards, so you don't have to worry about copying them all down. And we'll also have a link later on in the presentation to show you where you need to go to get these and more. So we have the application path, we have the install fail error, and then we have the application name. And you'll notice that I have variables set as $4, $5, so on and so forth. These are predefined variables in a script policy that I can set so that, like Lisa showed with her OS install, we can use one script for multiple different types of software. Here's what that looks like for my software verify install. I have the application path defined as variable 4. I have the application name for variable 5, and then I have the application install command for variable 6. So that way I've just got one script that I can use for multiple different applications, and I can install whatever I want and make sure that my environment is operating at peak efficiency. So I gave you an example here where I said you can call it from a terminal, and that's just sudo. You want to make sure that you're executing this as root, obviously. Jamf policy -trigger and whatever the trigger name is. Trigger name can be Bob, Disney World, so on and so forth. Since in a Disney World theme here. So the calling a custom trigger policy from another policy, I'm going to use the example of our media-based configuration stack, and this is just our general digital editing workstation. This is the setup for calling that custom trigger policy. If you look down here where that custom trigger checkbox is checked, I have media-based config, and then if the host name of the device matches the parameters for this media-based config, it's going to execute this policy. And then here's where the inheritance part comes in. If you look down at the bottom where it says execute command under the files and processes pane, it has Jamf policy trigger commons config, and this is just our general patron configuration setup. So that way I have software inheritance that installs at specific times in specific ways, and then I inherit the next thing so that I don't overwrite different configurations. All right, we got a little bit of a demo. I'm afraid that it is a console log output. Console log outputs aren't very exciting. I wish I'd thought about putting, some trailer exciting music to it, but unfortunately I didn't. So this probably looks very familiar to you. This is the var log jamf.log. There it goes. So that's the hardware check-in name. It's figuring out that I've got a laptop in this case, and then it's downloading my laptop setup application. Ignore the problem installing MDM profile. We don't worry about that. Whatever. And then it's checking for, policies triggered by name laptop, and then I've got a manual computer set up for our laptops that I run where I set the type of device and then the my asset tag that I have. All right, and now that we have the computer name that changed from MacBook Pro to libstaff-01866, now it's installing my staff configuration policies, and it's going to run through all of that. Okay, next up, software updates. Now, you're all aware that Jamf has the patch management going on. This was built prior to the release of patch management, and we've also just not been able to move our entire software stacks into patch management. So we had to build in a way to figure out the version of an application that's installed and then define the version of the application that I want to install for my software update process. Here are two examples of, this is just two panes of the same script. And I've defined pretty much the same thing that you saw in the software install, where I've got the application name, the path, and the needed application version. If you're not familiar with info plist and digging inside of an app file, this just drills down through the directories to gather the application version that's installed through the CF bundle short version string. We don't have to get into that right now because I'd probably fall asleep too. But what happens is if the application error file exists, that means that this has been attempted too many times and it's going to report back an error into my log. Otherwise, if the application file exists, check the version of it and compare it to the version that I have predefined in my predefined variables section. And that's what that looks like right here. I have my application name set, I have the application path, the version that I want to have installed. Once I run this policy, if the versions don't match, then it's going to update my application. And then I just have this running every week while the library is closed on Friday and Saturday night. So that I come back on Monday, I see that everything's updated, I go get coffee. Sometimes before and after. All right, and this is the software update device type check. This should probably look very familiar to you because we've got this matching my software install policy where I've just taken the list and replaced install with software update. It runs through the list, execute those policies, and then so on and so forth. Life is wonderful again. And then I have my software stack update list where I have these software stacks that are defined for each type of device, and each of these executes that script that you saw when checking for the version in each of these. This is the snapshot of the primary software update policy. And what we have going on with this is the first thing that it does is executes the software update check script. It checks for the type of the device that it is. In this case, it would be libstaff. It updates the staff applications, and then it executes the all Mac software update list, which checks for the standard configuration of software that's installed on every device in the environment. And have another demo for this. Again, I apologize for the console log output, but it's the only way that I know how to show it. So here we go. It's executing the software. We've got a staff machine in this case. We're checking for a software update check, Acrobat Pro, so on and so forth. Nothing much to see here except automation. So I've got a link of interest. I put links here, but I guess it should be link of interest. This is my discussion article where I have listed every script that I use in my environment. And feel free to ask any questions you have, or if you have any ideas that you think might make things better, I'd welcome it. With that said, I'd like to open it up for questions. We've got a mic right here, mic right here. No questions?
Sorry, I had a silly question.
Sure.
How did you initially kick off the naming? Did you name the device and then it goes to the trigger? I think I missed.
How did I configure the naming? Well, I have two different ways that I do that. For anything that I can do a reverse DNS lookup for, it's that hostname --s command that will then return that as a variable and executes the scutil command to name the computer based on that. And if it was libstaff-12345, then that kicks off the configuration policy.
So when you get a new device, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
So you get a new device and then you know it's going to go into a certain area of your campus.
Mm-hmm.
What is that naming? Where does that start?
That starts with our purchasing agent that tells me if it's going to be a staff device or a patron device, and then we have different categories of patron and staff that determine the name of the computer, and that's just been something that we've worked on and agreed upon with all of our purchasing and management.
So does that happen in your pre-enrollment? Like when you do DEP pre-enrollment? Is that what you
No, that happens when we register the device via DNS.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. Oh, okay. Because I really like that, the way that you have the name and then it kicks off the process.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering, how does the name get in there?
I register it in our network registration system for our desktops, and then that will, I name it that libstaff-12345.lib.ncsu.edu.
Okay.
And then when I search for that as a command in the script, it will return that name without the .lib.ncsu.edu. So that names the computer for me.
Oh, that's very creative. Okay,
Oh,
I
thank
think
you.
I get it. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hello.
Hi.
So I noticed that you do some of the version checking in the script rather than relying on smart groups.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason for that or an advantage?
The reason for that was, sorry, get over it. The reason for that was with smart grouping, we found that we didn't often return the version that we wanted in time, and the check-in on the computers just didn't match the time that we wanted. So instead, we had this software update script that kicks off at a specific time, and then that way it just runs through the entire stack.
So more of a compliance thing. You know it's always going to be the right version on that day.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. One's regarding the hash you did for your Mac OS install. You're just generating that hash from the existing installer, I take it then?
I generated that hash from the package that was created. So you can pull the command to generate the hash out of the same script that's verifying it so that you get the correct hash value to paste into the policy.
Okay, are your sample scripts in the same link, or do you have a different link for
They
that?
will be, they're not there yet, and I
Okay.
believe Jamf is sharing out the deck, so you'll have everything there.
Okay, I've used a similar process, but the hashing is a key component because we've had corrupted caches before, and it is painful, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's about thinking what might go wrong and taking steps in advance to try to avoid that. So.
And then I have another question. You mentioned, and I'm kind of using it, and I want to get away from it, but I'm using a single trigger for multiple policies. What have you run into when you do that?
Well, I've run into fun things where occasionally if I get a smart user who likes their computer name to be, oh, I don't know, Bob or Zephyr or whatever, it's anything that doesn't match our standard, then we have a part of the script that will report back that, hey, this has not been named correctly, and then it will fire off the manual computer setup that will prompt them to say, enter the type of the device you have, give me the asset tag, then it names the computer the way we need it to be.
Are you just using Jamf Helper, or do you use something like the EP Notify?
We've used Jamf Helper, and then we've also used it as part of our configuration setup script so that it will execute it both ways.
Okay,
And then I use part of an Apple script within the bash script to fire off those prompts.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Whoa, that's the second time I've done that. My question was about packaging. So when you're doing the updates, do you usually do, is it depending on the app, do you use a script for the installer of the app that does the update, or do you package every single version like on a cycle, maybe like weekly or bi-weekly? If there's a new one that comes out, you create a new package for it and let it update from that.
I caught some of that, so you're asking, do I package every single different type of version for every
Yeah.
single? Yes, we do. We use some of that with automated process like Auto Packager for as many apps as we can that will download the new versions for us. And then we have I guess an alliance with our central IT office that will download packages through their Auto Packager, and they upload that into the JSS for us. So we're able to choose those different versions, and then we're able to define those package versions when we package it up so that we don't have multiple copies of just, say, Photoshop and we don't know what version it is.
Do you cycle it like weekly, or just depending on the app, when they say, hey, there's a new update, they'll send it over to you?
I generally check for updates weekly, and I have an Auto Packager server that goes out to several different Git repositories that I use and will download the latest versions of apps.
Cool. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I wanted to ask you, in the erase and reinstall of the OS, do you need to account in your own workflow for users' content, if they had a backup? In my own situation doing that, I would have to, the user would be, what about my files? What about my content? What are you doing in that situation?
That's a really good question. So I would suggest probably making this policy require a login to self-service so that you know who did it on the device. You probably also want to use the must read the description option and paste a tersely worded warning there that it is going to erase all the content. Make sure you have a backup. Where that becomes much easier if you're using one of the backup solutions that makes it easier for the user to back up and then restore their data, such as Code 42 downstairs. That can make it easier. One enhancement you might want to do is, before the policy runs, you might be able to query how old the last backup is based upon whatever backup agent or solution you're using, so that you could possibly remind the user to take that backup before commencing.
Gotcha.
I'd also like to add, I was able to adapt Lisa's method and was able to implement an in-place upgrade for an OS for all of my patron environment. So it was, I left on a Friday, my entire environment upgraded from Sierra to High Sierra, and came back on Monday, and I had an environment of High Sierra machines with all of the content still in place. But definitely for things like staff, heed her word and invest in a backup solution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So in regards to patch management, I know you're using scripting specifically for that in lieu of doing the patch management through the Jamf console. I know you mentioned you did that because, well, you started doing this before patch management actually came out in JSS. Do you find that you're just not interested in using patch management? Do you find there's more control that you have over scripting, or?
Well, the theme over this entire presentation has been fine-grained control. So I do find that with this method, I have pretty fine-grained control over software updates that happen when I need them to happen. So I have a small window of hours in which the library is not open to users that I can get my software updates out. So this has been very useful for that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you give us a little refresher on the difference of the commands you were using? You had a dash event instead of dash trigger for the sudo Jamf policy option. Did I see that, or did I misread that?
No, you did. I think
Is there any difference?
I think it's really the same thing, but didn't it used to be dash event, and now we've got dash trigger?
Maybe if there's... Yeah.
Other way around.
Okay, so same thing, new name.
Yeah, same thing, new name.
Interesting, thank you.
Trigger will be deprecated probably in upcoming versions.
Don't tell me that. I got to go back and redo my scripts, man. Yeah. I'm sorry. Dash event is the new term, dash trigger is the old term. Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? All right. Well, thank you all for coming,
Thank you.
everyone.